you to the third in the second in our series, our fall series of programs that we present in cooperation with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office out of Dallas. This program is a little bit special because instead of slide presentations and such like we typically do, we're going to have an open conversation featuring a couple of our outstanding faculty members that have participated successfully with commercialization of technology, with the focus of this particular program being understanding IP license agreements and how they can help you as a researcher. So to lead off the program and to guide us through the discussion will be the OTC's Director of Intellectual Property and Technology Transactions, Dave Palmer. David Palmer joined us in 2015 with an outstanding and varied background in IP litigation. So since he joined us, he has been extremely valuable in helping our office and our licensing team specifically understand the perspective of the litigation issues that can come along with intellectual property and how to better, more effectively position our IP. A couple of things I want to say as housekeeping is, number one, we are recording this session because some of our colleagues let us know that they were not going to be available to attend. So we want to make sure the information gets out there. So we are recording the session. And number two, if you have any questions as we go through, we love to hear those questions. So please add them to the chat, as we're going to save some time towards the end of the conversation to address everything in the chat room as much as we possibly can. So without further ado, I turn it over to you, David Palmer.
Okay. We haven't done the intros to the panelists yet, right? So.
Oh, that's right. Let's intro the panelists. I can do that. Let me do that first before I turn it to you, Dave. Hold on. Very, very happy to have with us today Brian Davies. Brian is Associate Professor of Molecular Biosciences and also in the Department of Medical Education here at UT Austin. His research department focuses on protein-based antibiotics and bacteria host interactions. The Davies Lab research focuses on microbes and antimicrobials specifically. Brian has quite a bit of experience with intellectual property, licensing agreements, as well as company startup, company formation. He has 45 technical articles and 6 patents currently in process of prosecution or issuance. So we welcome Brian Davies in this discussion. Also joining us is S.V. Srinivasan. SV is the David Allen Cockrell Chair in Engineering, Cockrell Family Regents Chair in Engineering, number 7. His research department focuses on advanced design and manufacturing. Dr. Srinivasan is a professor, researcher, nanotechnologist, and entrepreneur, and he has an interest in creating high throughput nanofabrication techniques for applications in emerging electronics, display, and the healthcare sectors. He's been the director of the Nascent Center, an NSF-funded nanosystems engineering research program, and he has published over 130 technical articles and holds over 100 US patents, and has been a part of several startups, some current ones that are in the stealth mode, but we all know about back in the day, the molecular imprints. He played an important critical role in that, and that company continues to operate under the auspices of Canon Nanotechnologies as well as Magic Leap. So we welcome both of you, SV and Brian. Okay, Dave, I turn it over to you.
Great. And let me add my thanks to the panelists, Professor Davies and Srinivasan, for joining us for this discussion. I think first, I'd like to ask each of them to tell us about how intellectual property has or is playing a role in your research, in your lab, how you think about it, how it affects what you and your students do. And maybe we could start with Brian.
Thanks, Dave. So intellectual property does play an important role, I think, on several levels. First off, and I think how we think about the work that we're doing, a real kind of benefit to being in academia is that you get to go after some of those more outlandish and transformative ideas, that eventually will roll out and kind of become the new technologies and therapies of tomorrow. But in getting there, it is important to still recognize that there still is a pathway through intellectual property, through partnering, through companies. So having an appreciation for what those ideas in the lab today need to eventually be tomorrow really can kind of help inform some of those early ideas. They can keep all the excitement and interest, but if you've got 3 equally interesting and exciting pathways to go down, and one maybe has more of a track to actually getting IP around it for eventual rollout, that may be one way of strategizing. The other way, actually, I'll just touch on briefly is with both students, postdocs that we get in the lab, a good number of them are very interested in pursuing careers in industry. So having exposure to them early and frequently about the legal background that is required in order to get their materials out into the world, that's able to get companies to launch that next product, is really helpful, both in kind of shaping their way of thinking and their excitement around their work, but also in the way that they can then engage with future employers. And when they go out and they can talk in a very exciting way about their science at industry interviews, but then also come around and have this very clean understanding of how the IP issues relate to that, it really just kind of elevates them in that interview process. So certainly those 2 areas impact what we do. I could go on for many more, but I'll turn it over at this point.
Just to follow up on that, would you say that it's helpful to students as they go out to private industry to have had the experience of maybe being a named inventor on 1 or more patents and had some experience with the patenting process?
I think certainly it's another one of those ticks on a CV where, in addition to an excellent skill set, publications showing technical ability and productivity, good reference letters, if there's that extra added bit that they've actually been through the process, while they may not themselves have been actually, writing the patent personally, having gone through it, understood how even small details can greatly impact what can be patented and what can't be. It really kind of helps. It's a great way for them to understand at a more deep level how what they're doing is going to be able to really work within those companies they're looking at and be of great benefit.
Okay, thanks. SV, how would you say that IP has played a role in your lab, and how you think about it?
Okay, so I will make some points which are probably adding on to what was already mentioned, because many of the things that Brian discussed are some of the same things. I view them as the most important ones. So with respect to students and postdocs, kind of adding to what Brian mentioned, I think it is important to make the point that research includes academic impact as well as societal impact. And academic impact comes from peer review processes and publications, which is central to everything we do with our graduate students. And it's a process that students learn in graduate school, which stays with them for the rest of their lives. But patenting, I think, could be viewed as a different kind of impact, because if you're filing patents, it's with the intention of getting them licensed. So, naturally, we don't want to just file patents that end up on our resume. We want them to also be licensed. And that's not always easy. But if that is your intention from the beginning, you are forced to be relevant in the sense of solving really important problems. And so I think if we view the patenting process in that context, it becomes inherently central to education as to how we educate our graduate students. And so, you know, I always tell my students, we don't want to have necessarily a lot of papers to show on our resume. We want to have good publications and maybe 1 or 2 patents. And that, I think, kind of rolls off your resume in a nice way, because you understand the scientific process and the peer review process, as well as, you know, what is relevant in the work that you're doing. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is industry, you know, recognizes this kind of work, and it gives industry recognition to me personally and people in my lab. And I think that's very important because that helps in all sorts of ways. It helps with people getting good jobs in industry. As Brian mentioned, most of our students end up in industry. But it also helps from industry taking us seriously in the sense of funding our work in the university. So I think that is also very important when it comes to doing work that could be patented and licensed. And the last thing, which is a thing that has become very important in the last 10 years or so, is I'm actually able to recruit a lot of very good people, because if I tell them upfront that they're going to be doing something that's innovative that can be patented, it becomes a recruitment tool, because we're always competing for talent. And that, I think, is something that, as a faculty member, it benefits me greatly.
Okay, so maybe we'll move to the question of bringing research funding into the lab. One of the, you know, in our experience, you know, some faculty members are quite interested in leveraging the interest in industry's interest in IP to kind of motivate and bring funding, additional funding into the lab, and maybe establishing relationships with a company to sort of fund ongoing projects. Can you talk about that issue at SV and how you see that?
So yeah, I mean, most of the licenses we have done end up being exclusive licenses with a particular company, because that's the best way people like to license something. I mean, there are some cases where we have had non-exclusive licenses, but most often startups as well as big companies seek exclusive licenses. And naturally, it's a good thing to combine that with some funding, continued funding into the lab to support that license. So the company may be taking your technology and developing a product, but they also want to have a roadmap beyond that initial product. And you could become part of that by getting funding from that company. The other thing is, even with federal funding, it really helps to have a track record of licensing because there's a lot of federal grants where there's a section on sort of impact in general. And I think, and there are also set aside money in federal government, like NSF has something called a GOLI program, which is a program where you're supposed to work with industry. And in those sorts of programs, it really helps to have had successes in licensing.
Brian, do you have any thoughts about the relationship between intellectual property and being able to bring research funding into the lab?
Yeah, it's great. Just as a general bit, it can certainly play in those direct relationships with companies, and that's always a benefit to, you know, kind of develop another revenue stream outside of applying for grants and the usual routes. But I couldn't agree more strongly with what SV was saying about relationships between industry IP licensing endeavors and, you know, federal grants. That there's so many additional calls from NSF, NIH, USDA for that matter, where more and more you're actually seeing, and you know, I could go on and on. I'm just, you know, speaking from my own kind of my own lens of research, where I see more and more applications where they're still very much interested in the fundamental research, but they want you to bring in an industry partner, even at a minimum as a consultant, just so that you can kind of, as you talk along the way, you know, are you going down a path where, you know, maybe industry actually has a lot of experience and they know it's a dead end, or it's something that, they saw a few years as exciting, but it just wasn't within their, R&D profile to go after. And just kind of I guess just on a last note with funding, by engaging in having materials licensed, that whole process for me at any rate, really forced me to evaluate it kind of at a much deeper level. What's the real purpose of what I'm trying to make? And am I really reaching that need that I think I am? And that kind of depth of appreciation for the research area really just makes writing grants or applications of any type so much easier.
Let's talk a little bit about startup companies. It's quite common for us at the Office of Technology Commercialization to license to startups because, well, one reason for that is that, university research is often, very advanced in terms of, where the market is in comparison to where the market is. And so sometimes it's not as good of a fit for an established company because it's not, the runway to the product is quite long. And so then the startup is probably the best path in those cases. But I wanted to kind of ask our panelists, maybe Brian, you can start out. Do you have any experience with licensing to startups? And, if so, like how do you see the PI's role in a startup that's based on technology that comes out of the lab, if any?
Yeah, I think that it really does begin with really kind of pushing yourself to kind of have that deep sector knowledge of what's important. So we play kind of in two areas, one being biotechnology, the other being biopharmaceutical. And each of those have a much different kind of lens where, a biotech application, you could go from academic discovery to product, honestly, within a year. For the biopharmaceutical space, you're typically looking at a decade. So kind of an appreciation for where your technology sits or where your therapeutic lead sits at the time that you're looking to start thinking about licensing is really important to have an appreciation for that. So I would say that for licensing out to, I'll license to whoever's interested, so long as it's a good fit. But what I can certainly hear what you're saying, David, with that point where there are certain times where a large company may be just very mature in its kind of direction. It has a pipeline, it knows what it wants, it knows what it's good at. And if you come out with something that's very much disruptive, gets overused, but let's just say non-traditional, then that can often be, going to a startup can be a more attractive route because at some level, if it does really well, the big company is just going to buy it anyways after the startup's proofed it. Right. So we often kind of divide things up that way. What do we have that's really, really established that we can see fitting into a known pipeline that's going to match that industry's pipeline for kind of requirements for revenue? And if it's very advanced, we can think about larger companies and licensing. But certainly for some of the more novel ideas, startups can be a great way to go. And I do think it has to start with the PI and really having appreciation for what those sectors look like.
SV, what are your thoughts about licensing into startups?
Yeah, I think licensing into startups is really the only major avenue that I've been involved in. And I do believe startups and small companies create a lot of jobs, maybe some of the highest number of jobs in the last couple of decades. I don't know the exact numbers, but and that it is for all these reasons where big companies are not able to absorb new ideas for the reasons that Brian mentioned. And I would add one to that from my own experience, which is, large companies have their own R&D groups internally. And if you have an idea, but it has not moved all the way to a business model with a customer, the first place they send you if you go to that company is to their internal R&D group. And it's almost like you're competing with them. It's like selling snow to the Eskimos. And so I think that creates a barrier in the early days of of a technology when you go to a big company, because you're asked to talk to these guys who are supposed to be doing what you're doing. And, if your idea is really good, they might actually look silly. And so they may not promote your idea internally. So you need to get to the point where your idea has turned into some sort of a product with a serious customer that can give like at least a validation of some sort before you go to a big company. Otherwise, you're stuck in the mud dealing with the R&D group. That's something that I have noticed.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think that can definitely be the case. Although there's certain areas of technology, like in regulated FDA regulated drugs or something, where it's actually much more common for established companies to be looking for and to be willing to invest in something that's going to have a long runway, a long period of R&D before there's a customer. Just because I guess they're used to that, right? It's the time frame. The time frames are
right, and it's a different risk management strategy in that space, because they're trying to run many drugs in parallel because they don't know 10 years later which one's going to work, right? It clearly is a different situation. I have almost no experience in that area, but I do think that you bring up a good point, which leads to a related comment, which is it also depends on the quality of your patent portfolio. So with your early research, you may have one patent, but is that one patent by itself good enough to define a whole product line or a whole business in a big company? And in some cases, if that is, maybe then you're ready to go talk to them, right? But oftentimes you need to develop that patent portfolio to turn it into something that is bulletproof, and it comes in conjunction with creation of a product idea. And that's, I think, also important. It's just, if you're thinking about of these sorts of technologies, it helps to be a little bit paranoid, right? Because big companies can talk to you and just run away with it. It happens all the time in software, for sure. So that, I think that also makes it important to figure out how to grow your technology without having direct involvement with a big company in the early days.
Yeah, we do find that it's a very common, one of the most difficult problems in commercializing university technologies, especially in physical sciences, is that sort of period between published research proof of concept and actually product prototype, right? Where now there's that gap that needs to be filled before a bigger company is going to be willing to license in some cases, not all. Do you, Brian, do you have any thoughts about what are the issues confronted by a PI in terms of what kind of role you should play in a startup? Sometimes university-based startups are actually commercialized primarily by a PI, him or herself, as almost like a CEO at first, or sometimes it's graduate students that are going to take that ball and run with it, and then maybe the PI has a little bit different role, or maybe it's a startup that is based on some people, that contacts maybe of the PI who have some experience in the industry already, but like the idea enough to take it on and try to get funding for it. In each case, the proper PI role might be a little different, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, Brian.
Yeah, absolutely. My thoughts go on forever, so I'll try to keep it short. I just was going to mention as well, and I'm not sure how you want to handle them. I did just see a question pop up in the chat, so I wasn't sure if that was for later or not. But Dave, to your specific point, I think so. The PI, my experience is that the PI can really play, and I have not played all of these roles, but I've also observed them in kind of with my close colleagues, everywhere from being extremely involved to pretty much just completely hands off. And I know that's a really big spectrum. But if I just comment kind of maybe quickly on some of those decision points, the PIs who I see who kind of go full in, really try to become, they want to be the CEO, it's because they just believe in this entirely, and it's really what they want to do. And it's really not uncommon to actually then see these PIs go off and actually either take a leave of absence or just leave the academic life altogether to go run that company. Because I do think one of the a misconception that can be done is that you can be both a great CEO and full professor at the same time. Like, I know not all of us sleep a lot, but like even that's a little bit crazy. So, and of course it will also vary as well. Are you, actually I think one of the biggest success stories that came out of UT was a guy who figured out how to sell water, right? Like, did it amazingly well. Company was extremely successful, many other things in addition, but that's just the question is the involvement that you have to be as a CEO. Do you have a product that you already have a big customer base? They're already placing orders, and it's just a matter of, I don't know, printing a page and sending it off? Or do you actually still have to go out and raise Series A, Series B, Series C funding? Is it going to take years to really get that going? Can you do everything on your own? Do you need kind of a multi-person staff? And I think really kind of, again, having a feeling for what is going to be my real product to sell, how close am I to that, how complicated is it going to be to get there, or am I already there, can really help. And how much do I love academia versus watching my students go off and build? That I think are all those considerations come in each time a new company formation is possible. I can go on, but I'll actually just stop there for a moment.
Yeah, thank you. And with regard to the questions in the chat, I think we'll generally save them for our Q&A segment. But I was going to respond to something you said with, it's the it sounds like your view is like it's probably more realistic and a better idea for a PI to play, if they're going to play a role in a startup, it would be more as either a technology officer or maybe a consultant.
I would agree with that, and at least that's the route that I've taken. And the other level too is also to consider kind of how the company gets going. Were you able to have a close team where it's been funded through, say, some government contracts initially to get it going, or did a venture capital company come in, start it, and basically put in their own C-suite? And you may really not have a choice at that point. Maybe you got some stock options, but that might be about it. So it again is kind of that initial setup for where the PI can both want to play a role, but also maybe where they're actually in a sense able to play a role based on how the company was structured when it was set up.
SV, interested in your thoughts about a PI's role in startups coming out of their lab.
Yeah, I think Brian said it quite well. There's the whole spectrum of what people want to do. I have never wanted to be the CEO of a startup, and I think there are a few instincts that have served me well, and that's one of them. I usually tend to get into things which sometimes I think I should not have done, but that's one thing I have never done, which has been good. Because I think the problem with trying to be the CEO of a startup that came out of a professor's lab, which is, say, my lab, is the first thing the CEO has to do is to put together a leadership team to really kind of take the startup to the next level. And if you have one foot on both sides, it's very hard to play that role, because the CEO has to be all in, and that person has to then go inspire a set of people to join the leadership team, which is a very critical part of doing a startup. So I think the idea of a technologist or an advisor is what has worked well for me. The other thing is, I think this is kind of adding to what Brian said, which is you have to see where the technology is. As a founder, you have one important role to play, which is you kind of have a sense for what the risks are, both on the technical side and on the business side. And you have to see that gap and see how, in your best judgment, you can address that gap, and you can uniquely address that gap that nobody else can, right? And that is your natural role, because what are we trying to do here? We're trying to get an entity to be successful. and then everybody wins, right? And so you have to do that very objectively. It's not always easy to do, right? We're very passionate about what we do. We're biased. We think we're good at everything, whatever. But if you can do that objectively, you know, and you can document that, when you're bringing in a CEO or investors, they will look at that and they will appreciate the maturity that went into your thoughts on how you're going to help the company. And I think that is a case-by-case basis. So, but it is something that should be driven by the success of the organization.
Actually, if I could just add something to that, Dave, because it just actually, what SV just said, just really sparked something, again, personal appreciation for it, but is to just always stay humble with, you don't know what you don't know. And if you jump into those CEO roles, I'm just even thinking about this as kind of one of my closer interactions with a company as it got started, where I thought I actually understood what the route was. And within a short period of time, I realized how underprepared I was, and how having those professional expertises were in 100% necessary for success. And if I had been driving CEO, I probably would have driven it into the ground in 2 months. So, also having, if you're thinking about taking on that CEO role, really, again, having that appreciation, do I really understand what is going to be necessary to fill all these gaps, as we was saying, along the way to being successful? And I know as a PI, I don't think I personally have those at the moment, and I trust in other people who do.
One issue that can arise, especially as you kind of move along in your career, is you might actually have different, let's say, different inventions or different classes of inventions that are being researched in your lab that have either are licensed differently, or they have, you can see even before they're licensed that they're going to have very different commercialization paths and strategies. I'd be interested in your thoughts about the issues that arise from that type of scenario and how you manage it or deal with it. And I guess we could start with Brian.
In that regard, you mean like if you've got, is the idea to kind of try to ask, is there like an overview of how the different aspects can work together, or is it kind of recognition about how they shouldn't work together?
Well, I'm just sort of interested in how you might manage, like, let's say you've got an invention that's licensed to some particular company, right? And then there's somebody else that's working on something, or another team that's working on something that is really not going to be within the ambit of what that first company is doing. And so, but it's promising, and it has a different commercial pathway. And you have to kind of, think, one thing you have to think about is making sure that the IP in each case is clean, especially, if there's research funding coming back in to the lab to do further research, follow-on research of the first technology, right? And then there's intellectual property agreements about how that IP, that IP will now be obligated to that first company, right?
I think that's where it's going. And yeah, that to me does really come back to kind of lab and project management, and really having that, trying to have the clearest view possible about how each project is going to independently bring its value, but how it does connect to every other product. When you mentioned, though, there's, I think, probably the biggest complications, I agree, are if you're working closely with a company where there is research funding coming back in, and you certainly want to make sure that those resources are being used to advance that specific project. Or if you are looking to branch over into a new and related area, appreciating upfront that likely means you're going to have to roll that new IP in, or at least give the company an opportunity to look at it before anyone else does. So I think those are great considerations, and something that we talk about as a group and try to keep our eye on is how are all of our projects kind of related to each other? Where are those overlaps? But then as we get closer towards even just something as simple as disclosing a new invention, where do those lines stop? And as we continue to put research forward, are we blurring those lines, or can we actually develop something new that would, as you said, kind of have a clean route to IP and then licensing? That was kind of that was somewhat of a nondescript answer, other than to say, be vigilant.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about that, SB?
Yeah, I think it does create a lot of interesting constraints. And, I've been doing this much longer than Brian. So when I started out, there was limited information about these things. The internet was not even as advanced as it is now. So you could find things easily on for free. So I made some mistakes, and they were luckily not too costly. But like if you are working on a technology which has, let's say, two distinct applications, I'll give a specific example. One is in electronics and one is in healthcare. And those companies typically do not compete with each other, let us say. They're in different domains. Then, if you have that view from the beginning, you could give a field of use license to two separate companies. And you could, and the first instinct the first company will have is they'll say, no, we want a license in all fields. And then you have to make the point that, look, if we do this and you're non-competitive, you're actually putting 2 times the number of resources to eventually solve these problems. And you guys can work out a cross license. And it takes a little more extra effort, but in the long run, everybody benefits, because the most important reason why startups fail is that you never solve the technical problems, right? The technical problems are sometimes unsurmountable, and people give up after investing tens of millions of dollars. But now what you're doing is you're literally creating two groups of people working on the same thing, and they're not competitive. And if you can figure that out carefully, and I think we've done this a few times, right? It actually works out quite well. So
yeah, I would, with regard to field licensing and licensing the same invention in different fields, I'd add that if you as a researcher believe that some technology that you're working on has applications for different fields, where it might be the same invention might be useful and applicable in more than one market or field, it's very important to recognize that early and talk through the issues. We're happy to at OTC for sure, because there's it's possible to kind of establish a relationship fairly early and fairly quickly with one company that and what they ask for and what we give them is sort of everything, and doesn't leave those other fields available. So the difficult conversation SV's talking about is one you want to have before you've negotiated a sponsored research agreement that gives the sponsor rights in all fields to future IP in the invention. I think maybe the last question we'll pose relates to commercialization strategy generally in licensing terms. It's true when we at the OTC market and license inventions, there are various levels of involvement by the inventors, and different levels of activity and helping to market the inventions, or helping licensees understand the value of them. I'm interested in how our panelists see inventors being able to assist in the marketing and commercialization of their inventions, and also, conversations. What is the appropriate level of involvement with OTC and kind of talking about and setting commercialization strategy? You want to take a crack at that, Brian?
Sure. I think I've been in each thing that we've licensed from the lab. I've been involved, I would say, pretty heavily, at least in the beginning. Also, almost always myself and a senior graduate student or postdoc, because as the agreements even begin, there has to be kind of a lot of initial conversation, that the disclosure, the patent, even a paper or two are never going to be able to quite give the full picture for generally what the full picture of the technology is able to accomplish. So I actually see it as necessary and enjoyable, to be quite honest, to actually go out and talk to potentially interested folks. Every licensing agreement that we've actually had that has come through, I've probably spoken to anywhere from, I don't know, 3 to 20 different groups before one actually sees that it's the right item. What I also think is really important there is that you can really explain the caveats of the system. So we've certainly had instances where a group thought they were interested. We had a real deep discussion and we pretty much came to the conclusion, no, this isn't right. But they appreciated that so much that, at some time later, they came back and said, actually now, we're interested either in this other item or a different iteration of what we were thinking about a year ago. So I see the PI as having a very important role in really kind of interfacing and having that deep knowledge of both the potential, but also the real caveats of the system that are going to make for both a successful licensing and hopefully ongoing relationship with the group.
SV, what are your thoughts about PI involvement in commercialization strategy and marketing and even negotiating?
Yeah, so I think it's some of the people in this meeting are familiar with the NSF I-Corps program and other related programs, which talks about customer discovery, right? And that I believe is an integral part of what we should be doing as researchers, including myself and my students and postdocs. So talking to potential end users and customers is given, right? And that's the one thing that has changed dramatically in the last 10, 20 years, where it's become something that even organizations like NSF have identified as an important thing. And the reason it's important is, as Brian said, you talk to like 10 people and maybe one of them is interested, but the other 9, if you go in with a sincere pitch, will be obligated to tell you why they are not interested. And that's actually very valuable because that tells you that you may have been shooting in the wrong direction. And, half the problem is to know what to work on, right? And that really comes from these customer discussions. I think, so that part, I think it's obvious, right? But it's something should be done very systematically to constantly understand, if we build this, will they come, right? and it sounds like a simple thing, but that's the entire premise of the I-Corps program, which is, no, it's not a simple thing. You really need to understand the constraints carefully and decide what the needs are before you spend too much time working on it. So that part is, I think, very clear. The second part, which is really more the contractual part, the role I have played, and Dave and Les and everybody else knows this well, because sometimes, I call them too many times. But the role I play from my perspective is I want to help make the deal. Because if I don't, the deal will fall apart sometimes, right? And once the deal falls apart, nobody wins. And so I have a conversation on both sides, which means I'm conflicted. That is very clear. But at the same time, knowing that both parties know that I'm in the middle, they'll of course be careful with whatever they don't want to tell me, but they'll sometimes tell me things that I could help facilitate a real conversation. And I think that is kind of a role that I have played and hopefully have not upset too many people doing it.
Well, thank you very much for that and for your answers to these questions. I think now is a good time to turn it over to the audience for a broader Q&A, and I think Les is going to oversee that. Les?
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, SV, for your brutal honesty, especially with that last question. So yeah, let's go through some of the questions that came from the audience as we went through here. Here's one right here. If a nonprofit funds or gives a grant for the initial research, how do you see the ownership of the hoped for IP falling in the initial contract governing the payment for the research? So maybe Dave, you could take that one.
Okay, well, it all depends on what the exact terms of that grant are with respect to IP, and they differ quite a bit depending on the nature of the grantor and the negotiation that might occur. What we do we collaborate with the Office of Industry Engagement or Office of Sponsored Projects when there's federal money involved. They're the ones that negotiate the terms of these agreements for you. And we collaborate with them because, it's important that if there's intellectual property potentially involved, or maybe there's background intellectual property that's going to be used, that whatever is agreed to is consistent with the overall intellectual property strategy that we're pursuing, along with the researcher who's, the inventor or inventors. So we all want to make sure that we're on the same page and that the IP terms that for a given grant are consistent and don't prevent the appropriate commercialization strategy that we've selected. It's typical, the most typical term is that there'll be an option to license. I guess that's in a private setting, there'll be an option to license IP. In the case of a nonprofit, I've seen that also be the case for nonprofits. And then other times nonprofit might say, we're not going to use any invention that comes out of this, but since we're going to be funding it, we'd like to, and we know the university's probably going to license it if it's successful. Let's have a revenue share that we can agree on. And so then that would be negotiated. Do you have anything to add about that, Les?
No, that's interesting, and you're exactly right. But for the most part, the typical funding agreements from nonprofits, from even for-profit entities, the ownership of any IP developed out of that funding is really driven by inventorship. If the invention is made by the researchers here at UT, even under the funding of whatever the source, then UT will own the IP. As Dave was alluding to, there are many ways that the funding agency or nonprofit or company can access rights to that IP because they funded it. But ownership is driven by who invented it. If the collaboration occurred between our researchers here and the researchers at the nonprofit or the funding agency, there could be joint ownership. But ownership is driven mostly by inventorship. Is basically the answer to that. Okay, here's another good one that I want to throw to both of the panelists. SV, you go first on this. The last thing we were talking about was a little bit about your participation in the license negotiation process and where your comfort level comes and what you've seen basically with the vast experience you've had and how it works. What do you see as specifically critical license terms? And what I mean by critical terms are how they affect your research enterprise.
Interesting. So critical licensing terms and how they affect our research work. Okay, so I think most licenses maintain a research license so that we can continue to do the work. So that part's easy. There are some situations, I think we've done one license where the license was to a small company, it was not a startup, and we have given them access to sort of the instrument or equipment, but not everything else because that's likely all they would do. And that way we can continue to get research support from the downstream customers of that equipment. So it is important in licenses to make sure that you don't give away a very broad license and therefore limit continued support for the program. It doesn't help anyone, including that licensee. So that's one thing you can think of. I mean, other than that, I have not had very much success getting licensed with big companies, but with big companies, I have heard that a sort of a one-time payment or a something which has a limit on the upside might help for big companies because they often feel, at least in our fields, that they're bringing in a lot of background IP, and the IP that we're adding on its own is not sufficient to justify a percentage of all the revenue that they would get from it, right? So let's say they have a pile of patents and we add a few patents, and now they create a product for us to expect a percentage of their entire revenue, maybe a showstopper with big companies sometimes.
Mhm.
So I have never done this before, but I've talked to people who've had success, going to the auto industry and getting a license where there is kind of a cap on how much money would be paid out every year. And that might actually enable licensing to big companies.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Brian, let me throw the same question to you. Importance of specific license terms to your research.
I think SV just actually hit on them really well. So, just briefly, really that you retain academic freedom to continue to use your technology, and certainly embedded within that you can publish without having to run everything by the company.
Yes.
Assuming that it's not, assuming that you're not divulging something that was previously agreed to. And the more narrow the license you can give without, impinging on that licensee's abilities, the better. To give you more flexibility to advance the work. Just really everything SV had mentioned.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah, I've got a couple thoughts on that, Les.
Sure, go ahead.
Just, I think just for the benefit of any researchers who haven't really been down the road yet, like some of the key terms would be, when we negotiate a license, would be exclusivity versus non-exclusivity. And that really is driven by what is the most important, what is the need of the licensee for commercialization. And, usually it's exclusive. Field limitations, as SV had discussed earlier, is another key issue that is driven by the commercialization strategy. And if you keep your different fields available for, then it might actually benefit you in terms of being able to get more sponsored research back in the lab, right? Obviously, royalty rate, largely driven by the market dynamic, what's typical in that particular industry. Sometimes we negotiate for a specific level of sponsored research commitment back into the lab. If the PI is interested in that, we're happy to do that. And some companies are pretty happy to be generous that way in these license agreements. We look for commercial milestones, that discrete steps on the path to commercialization that have to be achieved by a certain date, so that because sometimes there's maybe you bet on the wrong horse and there's just failure, but the failure isn't necessarily due to the technology, but it's more company specific, and you want the ability to get the technology back and maybe have another crack at it. So I'd say those are some of the key terms that we look at.
Thank you. That's exactly right. Thank you. Let me wrap up. We're coming to the end, and let me just throw one more question to both of our researcher panelists. What other tips or lessons learned about commercialization of your IP do you think would be worth sharing with the group? You first, Brian.
I found it extremely beneficial to look at companies who are in the same sector, who have really been trying to make a go of it, make friends with them, go out to coffee with them, try to learn as much as you can really about the nuts and bolts of that sector that you are part of. And it just comes back to something earlier that I mentioned, that staying humble and recognizing that there's always something that you cannot know all of a company's interests ahead of time. So just being aware of that deficit and trying to fill it by having as much kind of commercial interaction as you can, really even just on a social level.
Excellent. SV, what about you?
Yeah, so I would say my I guess, advice to everybody is about commercialization is do it. It's a great thing. And it's sort of, Brian has talked about humility a couple of times. We, in academia, especially when we are writing that front end of a proposal, we have soaring rhetoric about how this is going to change the world. So try it, and then you will see how easy it is to change the world. It's not. And I think it makes you very grounded. When you say things like, I'm doing research that's transformative, without actually having tried to translate your research, I think it's somewhat insincere. So I'm saying to everyone, do it.
Excellent. Thank you. What about you, Dave? Any comments on that? General tips or lessons about commercializing university research?
No, I don't have anything to add. I think SV's point is a great one to end on.
All right. This has been an excellent program. I really want to thank again SV Srinivasan, Brian Davies, and also David Palmer for leading the discussion. It's been extremely informative, and we really appreciate you guys and all the work that you do in your labs with your students, supporting our office and submitting invention disclosures and spreading the gospel of commercialization throughout your research areas and with all your colleagues. So we really appreciate you guys, and we appreciate all of our faculty, actually. And so thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. And please reach out to licensing@otc.utexas.edu if you have any additional questions that come to mind after we sign off. And we will get right back to you as quickly as we can. Because the one thing we have is all the answers. All right. Thanks, everybody.